I enjoy hearing true spooky stories from other police officers. In my personal experience, I've only ever had one strange encounter on the job. When I first started around 6 years ago, I was fresh off of field training. I started out one night shift, working a slow district. My area was mostly false alarm calls, motor vehicle crashes, and the occasional domestic. My area was comprised of well-to-do citizens with very large houses. At the time, we were having a string of daytime burglaries. I got a call for a suspicious person around 1 o'clock in the morning. The lady calling was the homeowner, saying she had seen someone in her yard. She then heard noise up in her attic and hit her panic alarm. My entire zone, which was made up of 4 of us, ran silently, no lights or sirens, due to it being dispatched as a burglary. When we got on scene, we made a perimeter around the house, while 2 of us went in and searched the residence. We went through every square inch of that house and could not find a soul. When my partner and I finished our search, this young lady is holding her daughter and is shaking. I had told my buddies to leave as I talked to her filling out a false alarm slip. She could barely get the words out while asking if I had searched her garage. I told her that I had. She asked if I had searched the upstairs apartment. I realized at the time I missed something in my search. I was a whole 22 years old at this point, full of piss and vinegar. I decided to go search the upstairs to the garage by myself. I began walking up the stairs and heard several loud thumps and what sounded like furniture being moved around. I drew my gun to the low ready and called for my backup officers to return to the scene. I began giving verbal commands as I continued to walk up the stairs in the garage that led up to the apartment. The stairs were eerie to me for some reason. They felt like they went on forever, like a fatal funnel leading to the door at the top left. Thinking I was about to come nose to nose with a burglar, I began screaming loud commands. "Police department, make yourself known. Come out with your hands up." I yelled only to be greeted back with nothing. At this point, the silence was deafening. I swung open the door and remained in cover as I cut the pie and began clearing the room. I continued to yell commands with no reply back. At this point, my backup was running up the stairs behind me. We methodically clear the entire apartment and find nothing. We holster our weapons and scan over the rooms. The windows are locked from the inside, no forced entry, but the rooms look disturbed. There was furniture upside down or knocked over in every single room. It was consistent with the loud thumps I had heard. I left my buddies upstairs and went to speak to the homeowner. I asked her when she was last upstairs in the guest apartment. She told me she was up there cleaning earlier. She said she had company coming in from out of town tomorrow. I asked her to come upstairs and tell me if anything looked out of place. When she put eyes on the apartment, she turned white. I asked her what was wrong. She said that none of the furniture was this way earlier. There was an uneasy feeling in the room after that. She had told me she was getting a hotel room and leaving with her daughter for the night. I decided to write a report on the incident due to how unusual it was. When I went and looked in the system, there was a suicide call where she was a complainant a year prior. She had found her husband dead in the upstairs apartment. They were in the middle of separating, and she had found him deceased upstairs one morning after hearing a gunshot. I used to think paranormal occurrences were BS, but there was nothing that could explain what I heard and saw that night. To this day, I get chills driving by that house. The middle school I attended was the first high school built in the downtown area of my hometown in the early 20th century. Comprised of 3 main halls, a gymnasium and a large office building where the library and auditorium were located. At this time, my mother worked in the main office and would work through the summer while students and teachers were gone. On one such day, she was in her office alone when she heard the front door open and the sound of a group of children walking towards the office. She called out with her normal friendly demeanor, expecting them to round the corner at any moment. Instead, she heard the door to the auditorium open and the sounds go with it. Now, thinking some children were where they were not supposed to be, she quickly got up and walked into the auditorium to tell them to leave. She was confronted with only empty and lonely seats and the dark, unlit stage. Feeling uneasy, she began to exit, and as she did, she heard a child giggle somewhere in the darkness. Shortly after, she was again in the office alone, when suddenly she heard a loud banging coming from the library above her. Worried but dutiful, she made her way up the stairs and opened the door to the library. Every chair and table was tossed and tipped aside haphazardly and cluttered. Scared and annoyed, she quickly reset everything and made her exit. She would go on to complain for weeks about this repeating in that location. The final and most extreme of her experiences happened in the office. She was filing paperwork and organizing things for the assistant principal, who was not on school premises at the time. She was walking back and forth between her office, the conference room, and the assistant principal's office. She had just walked into the conference room and felt a sharp and aggressive tug on the back of her head. She whirled around, expecting to see an assailant, but there was nothing. Determined to stand her ground, she mustered up her courage and shouted out that she would not be bullied or made afraid, and that she had work to do, as if pre-reminding a child. After which, things calmed down in that building. The 8th grade hall was a whole other matter entirely. The summer going into 7th grade, we decided to do a little ghost hunting of our own. A trio comprised of myself, my mother and my grandfather entered the empty hall in the late afternoon. We sat on the old steps in silence for a while, looking down the hall with our backs to the entry to the girls' gym. After a while, we began to hear what sounded like footsteps on the old basketball court in the girls' gym. Startled but excited, we quickly walked into the empty gym. The court creaked and whined as we walked across it until we came to a halt in the middle and just stood there for a minute. An eerie feeling came over us, and a creaking began to sound from the court, as if footsteps were circling around us. Feeling uneasy, we began our exit. As we opened the double doors of the gym into the main hall, all three of us looked down at the end of the hall that connects the 7th and 8th grade halls together, and saw a tall, thin, and inky black figure swiftly glide across from right to left and out of sight. Filled with hormonal courage, I charged down the hallway towards it, but by the time I reached the end of the hall, there was nothing to be seen. Freaked out, we called it a day. Sometime later, after school hours, I finished training with the track and field team and was walking up to the main office where my mother was. As I was walking, I began to hear a loud and repetitive banging noise. Confused, I looked around for the source. I looked up, and through the high windows of the girls' locker room, I could see a single locker door opening and slamming shut repeatedly with force by itself. I stood there for a minute in bemusement, thinking it was a vent or something causing it, but no other locker doors near it moved. It continued to slam loudly as I made my way to the office. I don't know when it stopped. The final tale I have from this location is the one that creeps me out the most. Over summer, going into 8th grade, while the buildings were mostly empty, a group of electricians and custodians were tasked with climbing up into the crawl space above the 8th grade hall to solve a problem. They were going about their casual conversation in the front office where my mum was, drinking coffee and laughing as she heard them exit and head to the hall. About 20 minutes pass, and she says they all entered the main office. None of them were talking, no laughing, their entire demeanor now off. These big burly man's men are now pale as paper and are avoiding eye contact with her. She approaches the main custodian, a friendly, usually candid older gentleman, and asks him what's wrong. He brushes her off in a somewhat rude manner, that nothing is wrong and that they are just working some things out. 2 years pass, and none of those men will speak a word about it, until one day my mother confronts the main custodian, demanding what made him act so craven that day. He breaks and finally tells her. He says that he and a few of the guys went up into the crawl space that day, that they had been working up there for 10 minutes when they saw something that scared these men so badly that they would rather be reprimanded for not doing the job than go back up there. Men who pride themselves on their integrity, turning away from their responsibility out of fear of what was up there. When she pressed him for more details, he refused and told her to drop it, never speaking about it ever again. I was a rural sheriff's deputy in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. It was around the mid-90s. We had 2 of us who patrolled almost 500 miles of road, and it wasn't uncommon for weird stuff to happen. These are the ones that I still can't explain. On patrol one night around 2 a.m, with no moon, going down a pitch-black country road, I'm traveling around 60 miles an hour, and I come to a set of small rolling hills. I go down the first hill, back up, back down, and as I get to the bottom, there is a person right in front of my car. It looked like an old woman in a white gown. I know it sounds like every scary movie, but this is what happened, and I knew I was going to hit her. I locked up the brakes, and she was dead center of my cruiser, about 10 to 15 feet out. I braced for impact, and I guess I locked up the brakes so hard that I fishtailed at the last minute. She passed right beside my door and window. I could have reached out and grabbed her. Of course, it all happened so fast it was a blur, no features on the person. I stop. Thank God I didn't kill some poor old woman who wandered out of her house. And you guessed it, she was gone. And to top it off, this was right next to an old church and cemetery. I looked and yelled and never saw the woman again. Eventually, I got creeped out and just left. I have no idea what the hell happened. There are no houses within miles of this church and cemetery. My second story, a few years later or before, I can't remember. At this point it was decades ago. Same part of the county, not that far away actually, just a few miles down the same exact road. Similar time of night. I'm on patrol, and I'm coming up to a giant straight stretch of the road that contained a 4-way intersection. I see headlights approaching me, and I slow down to come to a stop at the intersection. I realize after a few seconds the headlights are just sitting in the road, about 100 to 150 yards away. Strange, but not the weirdest thing. It could be a drunk. I start driving up to see what's happening, and the headlights go out. So I stop for a second and wonder what the hell is happening. The lights come back on. I sit there for a second, and both lights elevate about 10 to 12 feet off the ground, and then come together to form a single bright light. At this point, I'm starting to feel my skin crawl. The light immediately goes out. It definitely wasn't an aeroplane. It was a narrow stretch of road with trees on both sides. I turn all of my lights on and go down the road and try to figure out what it was I just saw. I came across nothing. No cars, farming equipment, nothing. There was no way whatever was in that road could have gotten around me or turned around and left without me seeing them. To this day, I have no clue what those lights were. This story comes from my mother from back when she was a teenager. A guy she knows takes a job with a local funeral home. He works the graveyard shift. All was well for the first few months. The dude is often weirded out at work, claims that the building is haunted. Earlier in the evening, they get a call from the hospital saying that they have a lady there ready for pickup. They pick her up. The guy is freaking out. He says he has a bad feeling. Later in the evening, the mortician has to step out for a bit, leaving the guy there alone with the deceased lady. He goes about his work, still a little freaked out. Suddenly, he hears this low, soft moan. He swears it's just his mind playing tricks on him, and he goes about his business. He hears it again, a little louder than last time. It is late, he is alone. He is just hearing things, probably just the pipes settling. The plumbing is old after all. A short time passes, and it's louder. At this point, he is sure he isn't just imagining things. He knows he heard the dead lady moan. His first thought was the mortician was messing with him. He has been shaken all evening, and this asshole is pranking him. He marches over. "Very funny, you dick," yanks back the sheet covering the dead lady, expecting to find the mortician somewhere around her. The dead lady grabs the guy's wrist. He lets out this scream and bolts for the door, forgets his car, and runs all the way home. Turns out, the old lady wasn't dead. The hospital got it wrong. Hooray, 1950s medicine. She had been in a coma or something, and they had been sure she had passed on earlier that morning. She woke up at the funeral home and scared the ever-loving hell out of the assistant. He quit the next day, saying he would never set foot there ever again. I've worked at a nursing home for the last 12 going on 13 years. I work nights pretty much exclusively, and I'm very used to this place in a much more liminal state than the day shift sees. Empty halls, dim lights, far fewer people. It's not scary, it's strangely comfortable. That being said, a lot of people who have worked this shift with me claim we're haunted by at least a few different people who used to live or work here. I've personally only witnessed a few things, and none of them felt really malicious and have other explanations, so I just roll with it and move on. Here's a few things they've told me about or that I've seen. 1. A woman in a brown skirt and jacket sometimes is seen by the CNAs walking the halls. If she goes into a room, we need to keep an eye on the resident because they're likely to have health issues in the next 24 hours. More than one nurse has told me this is the case. I've never seen the woman, but they swear she's here, and she's the ghost of a former RN who is still doing rounds. 2. One of the units has a friendly little girl apparition, apparently. Granted, a lot of residents have dementia and tend to tell us things that aren't there. Bugs, dogs, that kind of thing. But there's been very consistent reports of residents seeing this cute and sweet girl and talking to her, only to die the next day, despite not really having any conditions that tank suddenly like that. But it only happens on this one unit, and no other ones in the building. Staff that work there regularly will always find an excuse to have a doctor see residents who start saying they've seen a little girl, even if they don't have any external signs of distress or anything. 3. Cold spots. People complain about these frequently, and sometimes it's just the roof fans blowing cool air into the hallway. At least once though, it was definitely a little more sinister. For a month or so after an ornery resident passed a few years back, anytime someone went into the room they died in, they'd complain how cold it was. It was always a few degrees colder in there than the rest of the hall, even with the windows shut. Maintenance couldn't find a good reason for it, and it eventually just stopped on its own. But people hate going in there, and said it felt like someone was watching and staring daggers into you. 4. Charts falling down. When we still used paper charts, more than once, they'd have been completely settled on a shelf 1 second, and the next, a bunch would just fall to the floor. I saw that one a few times over the years, ranging from 1 chart to a solid dozen. No one could find a reason for that one either. Everything was stable and the shelves were level. The charts would just dump onto the floor. 5. Electronic nonsense. Okay, this one is my baby. I love this entity, or entities if they're a thing, and they're about the only ones I'll actively say are here when people ask. Everything electrical or electronic in this building acts strangely. It's not bad strange, nothing life-threatening or anything, but call lights will go on or off on their own. Room lights and fans do the same. Sometimes the computers aren't right either, and the phones spent a week flickering in and out of static at one point. If it were just stuff that was plugged in, I would say it's just a messed up wiring situation, and that probably does play a part. But there's also several cases of battery-powered electronics doing this sort of thing. When we still had chair and bed alarms for people prone to dangerous self-transfers, they would go off when there was no one on them at all, or when there were people completely still on them and asleep. The second you investigate by looking into the room, they'd stop. I liken this one to a bunch of playful kids, and I found when you're polite and ask, things sort almost immediately after. Weird stuff. A few years back, I was sitting with a resident who was in the process of passing on. It was one of those, this will likely be any minute situations, and their family were all in other states, and it would take a few days for them to get in. I don't like people to be alone in those moments if I can help it, so I pulled up a chair and sat at the bedside, talking to them just so they had a voice. At the exact time the resident breathed their last breath, a music box that had been closed in a drawer near them started playing. As far as I knew, that music box had been broken for months prior to this, but the resident didn't want to get rid of it because grandchildren had given it to them. The box stopped when I took it out and opened it up, and I couldn't get it to work again afterwards. It was weirdly nice, like they were telling me they were alright now or something. During my junior year of high school, my dad moved into a new house after a divorce from my ex-stepmom. I had 2 younger siblings between the 2 of them, a younger brother and a younger sister. Since I lived with my mum a majority of the time during high school and stayed on campus during my first college semester, I shared a room in this house with Anna, my younger sister, who is about 9 years younger than me. Alex, my younger brother by about 6 years, had his own room down along the hall. This incident takes place in the upstairs hallway. For context, the hallway comes off of the kitchen. Going down it, you'll pass the kids' bedrooms on the left, with Alex's bedroom door across from it on the right. Continuing down, the hallway ends in a small square, with the entrances to Anna's and my room and Dad's room sitting catty-corner to each other. One night, the summer before I started college, I was coming home late from a date with my, at the time, boyfriend. It was about 2 a.m, so everyone in the house was asleep. Coming in the house, I knew my dad was dead asleep because I could hear him snoring. I went upstairs and walked to my room. Alex and Dad's doors were shut, meaning they were both asleep. Anna was asleep in our room, and I threw my phone onto the bed and went to the bathroom to get ready for bed. I shut the bathroom door and started getting dressed for bed and brushing my teeth. As I was finishing up and brushing my hair, I hear a noise from outside the bathroom door in the hallway. This didn't really surprise me, since Alex usually got up in the middle of the night to use the restroom. I went to open the door to tell him I would only be just a second, but before I turned the handle, I stopped. The first noise I heard had been the creaking of the wood flooring in the hallway, but now I heard a different noise. It was breathing. Now, that doesn't seem scary in itself, but it wasn't normal breathing. It was heavy, not labored or anything, just heavy. I don't know how to explain it, but there's a difference between the sound of kids breathing and adults breathing when you hear it in dead silence, but the breathing sounded like an adult. I could still hear my dad snoring, so I knew it wasn't him. It couldn't be Alex. That's why I stopped in the first place. That, and as the footsteps moved to the kitchen, they sounded heavy, like a grown man walking around. This was when I started panicking. My first thought was an intruder. There was a sliding door back in the kitchen that led to the backyard, and our fence was by no means unclimbable. I was worried that one of the kids must have left it unlocked when they went to the park behind the house and no one noticed. I knew for sure I locked the front door when I had come in, but since I didn't use it, I hadn't checked the back door. Since it all made sense in my mind, I started panicking even more. I locked the door and held my breath, and I could hear the breathing start to come down the hallway. The creaking of the floorboards signaled how close it was to the bathroom door. I held my breath, frozen in absolute fear. The breathing was heavy and crystal clear, like a man was standing directly on the other side of the door. I was shaking with fear, and my dad always locked his door at night, so he couldn't help my siblings. I didn't have my phone on me. It was in my room on my bed. I didn't have any sort of weapon in the bathroom. I hadn't heard any more movement from outside the door, and the breathing was still there. I slowly and quietly knelt down so I could look under the door. I was looking for feet. I was so scared I could hear my heart beating in my ears. There was nothing. No feet, and suddenly no breathing. The creaking was gone too. I got up, still trying to be quiet, and grabbed my hairbrush. I figured that was the best thing I'd have for a weapon, and I was just going to make a mad dash to my phone on my bed. I held the hairbrush and quietly unlocked the door, then held my breath and listened. Nothing. I whipped the door open and looked up and down the hallway. Nothing. I ran to my room and grabbed my phone and called my boyfriend I had been on a date with hours prior. I even asked him if he could come inside after he dropped me off. I was so sure there had been someone in the house. With him on the phone, I went through and checked the whole house. There was nothing. I checked the back door in the kitchen and it had been locked. Alex and Anna were sleeping peacefully, and I could tell by Dad's snoring he hadn't woken up either. I went to bed that night with my door locked. The next morning, I told my dad everything that had happened. He could tell that I had genuinely been scared, so he checked everywhere too. Apparently, we had an alarm system too, and it hadn't gone off that night. It wasn't an intruder, or at least, not a person, but it was so real and so terrifying that I didn't go visit my dad for a while after that. And it was a few months before I spent a night at that house again. This is a 100% completely true story. I'm quite a skeptical person and don't believe in superstitions. However, based on my own past experiences, I do believe that ghosts or some part of paranormal entities exist in this world. However, at the same time, I think some people make up stories, or some explainable thing happens that is mistaken for a paranormal encounter. When I was smaller, we lived in a typical suburban house with a pool and a very large yard. I wouldn't call the house haunted, but there were a few weird things going on that I'd like to share. This happened to me around the ages of 7 to 10 years of age, as we moved out to another town when I was 10. There were 3 activities that took place. From the living room, you could see out to the dining room. There was a 3-seater couch that sort of defined the bounds of the 2 spaces. I initially thought my eyes were playing a trick, but occasionally while playing in the living room, I would notice a sort of boy walk past the couch. However, you would see nothing but only the top of his head. Think of Dennis the Menace haircut, except his hair was more of a hazelnut color. I would see this boy walking past the couch at least weekly. It looked exactly like another person would. It was only some months later when my mother was sitting with me in the living room, both staring out towards the dining room, that I noticed the boy's head walk past the couch, and my mother reacted to it and asked if I had seen a child walk past. That was when I told her that I see him fairly often, but I don't ever see any other part of him. She also admitted she would see something from the corner of her eye at times, but thought it was her imagination. Later on, my brother, who's a year younger, also confirmed he would see the boy. It was really weird, because it was just the top of his head you would see. You would never see his eyes. He would never stop. He never ever called out to anyone or made a sound. always just a head walking past the couch. I never felt any presence or anything weird. The second thing that would happen, which took place a couple of times a year, was that when I would play outside, I would hear someone call my name. It was more of a feminine voice, and it was like a loud whisper, but from a distance. This always happened when I was alone in the yard. It was definitely not my mother, as sometimes my mother had gone out shopping or was at work. I always felt like I was being watched, and that the air would become colder. This would happen even during the day, and it always happened outside of the house. I don't ever recall it taking place inside. The last thing that would happen is I saw shadows that moved. Shadow people, according to Reddit. Only some years later, I found out that my brother also regularly saw them. I once brought it up with my mother, who used to say it was from watching too much television, or just my mind playing tricks. Now, the shadows were always out of the corner of my eyes. Like, as soon as you try to focus on them, they would disappear around corners. Or if I was walking down the passageway and I turn around, I would see closer to me, about a meter or so, but it would run away and disappear around the corner or behind a door. It felt as if I caught them red-handed, and they would scurry away as they were afraid to be seen. It was always one shadow at a time, but I got the feeling it was different shadow beings, not one constant one. They were slightly skinny, and I could never see the outline of any clothing items. I never saw shadows anywhere except for that house. My brother was the only other person to see them. My parents never did. I put that down to being that kids are more sensitive to paranormal encounters. My siblings and I all seem to have had experiences with the same spirit. My sister and I have only caught a glimpse, but my brother's gotten a good look many times. The spirit has a stereotypical horror movie look. It appears as a pale woman, average height, thin, with long dark hair down to at least her waist. Her hair is dirty, oily down to the ends, so it almost looks wet. She wears a white dress or gown, also very dirty and yellowed. Her feet are dirty too. She seems to always appear barefoot. Her skin is sickly white and veiny. I only saw her once and got the impression that she was ill, like physically deceased. My brother is the only one of us who's seen her face. He says anytime he's seen her, she's looking right at him, usually standing over him when he's laying down, or looming behind him, smiling excessively like she means to taunt him. He woke up to her standing beside his bed most nights for a year or more. He says she made him too scared to move, that she was smiling but looking like she hated him. I think he said she whispered something to that effect to him before too. He even saw her in the back seat of his car once and almost crashed. I've only seen her once in a dream. In the dream, I'm standing in the bedroom the three of us had to share in the small apartment we moved into right after our parents divorced. It's dark in the room, but I can see the lamp in the living room is on, so I walk to it. Standing in the living room, I see that the light is on in the kitchen. The kitchen has a bar over the countertop and a row of cabinets drilled into the ceiling, so they made a long narrow window. The woman was suspended in the air, laying flat on a bed. The first thing I saw was her oily hair dangling. Then I noticed the backs of her arms and hands, her dress hanging from her, the backs of her calves, and the dirty, black heels of her feet. She was high enough off the ground that the upper cabinets blocked everything else. The dream had an uncomfortable feeling that I had wandered in and was seeing something I wasn't supposed to. I remember being afraid of her and wanting to leave before she noticed me. Then I woke up, and that was it. My brother and I were swapping ghost stories a few years later. I told him about it. He had never mentioned his experiences with the woman to me before that, and spilled it all after. I asked why he'd never brought her up, and he said seeing her made him feel crazy. He felt relieved when he heard I saw her too. We called my sister up, and asked if she had ever seen anything in the many places we'd lived as kids, making a point not to share what we had talked about. She eventually told us that she had seen the dark silhouette of a woman with long hair in a light-colored dress one night, watching her from the hallway of the apartment in my dream, the divorce apartment. She and my brother were both awake for their experiences. My sister experienced sleep paralysis for the first time in the divorce apartment. She never saw anything when this happened, just felt something malevolent in the room with her. Her sleep paralysis continued on to my grandmother's apartment, who they moved in with after I got married and moved away. That's where, and around the time my brother started to see her. She tormented him for a long time. I didn't have my dream until some years after she stopped, and he hasn't seen her since. I think about it a lot and wonder sometimes about what she is, how long she's followed us around, why she was so bold and aggressive with my brother, but not my sister and me, and why she stopped. For my brother's sake, I'm glad that she did. I work night shift at a 1920s mental hospital. Obviously, countless people have died here for various reasons: hangings, a murder-suicide, beatings, accidental overdose, electroshock therapy, etc. There are 4 floors, with the 4th floor being the well-known hotspot for paranormal activity. Me being security, I have to check it out every once in a while. The 4th floor is essentially an extremely long hallway, approximately 1,800 steps, with housing units on both sides throughout. Each unit has a 5-inch thick steel door, and there's a window at the very end of the hall. They don't house patients due to the fact that the county took over for a while before I started, and it's completely empty by the time the 3rd shift rolls around. The 4th floor is also the only floor in the entire complex that is completely off the ground due to the complex being built into a hill. It is also where the electroshock therapy took place a long time ago. This experience happened Wednesday last week on 3rd shift. I wanted to do a walk through the 4th floor that night around 3 AM for no other reason than I was feeling brave. I walked all the way down the 4th floor to the window. Eventually, as I got closer, I started seeing that the window obviously needed cleaning. When I got about 5 feet away, all of a sudden there was a handprint that would have been extremely noticeable from even 15 feet away. I looked at the handprint, turned around, said nope, and walked back down the hall. On my way back from the window, I peek into a side office area with my flashlight just to look. Nothing. I kept going. After a couple of seconds, it sounded like someone was running up behind me, so I walked even faster because everything in my body said not to turn around. As I kept walking, I passed by a unit, and as I passed, I heard what sounded like someone punching the door. I put it up to paranoia due to the running I heard prior. That is until I passed another unit. Another loud thud, as if someone punched the door. So at this point, I start speed walking down the hall, and while I am, I hear footsteps following mine. Mind you, these units are not connected at all, and the entire floor is completely empty. That's just one of my experiences. I've also been having dreams of a white, skinny woman in a hospital gown that has black hair with bangs on her face. I always thought she was just a reoccurring person in my dreams until I talked to one of the CNAs that worked nights in the kids unit. I never brought her up to the CNA. We were just talking about ghosts, and she said that numerous people have said that they have seen the exact woman I just explained. I explained to the CNA in detail about how she looked in my dreams, and she just went pale with her mouth hung open. Supposedly, this ghost is extremely well known throughout the hospital by various people. People have seen her in mirrors, have been locked in bathrooms, and have seen her just walking around. But in my dreams, she always just appears to run up to me, grabs me, and screams in my face. There's this one dream in particular where I woke up from a dream to wake up in my duplex's stairway. I walked down the stairs, because that's where my bedroom is, and walk into my bedroom. Once in my bedroom, I see my bed, my fiancée sleeping on her side of the bed, and myself sleeping. In front of my closet, which is on my side of the bed, I see that same woman standing next to my body, just staring at me. I walk up to her, and I get the courage to ask her just who the hell she is. She looks at me, grabs me, screams in my face, then shoves me onto my bed, which is when I officially woke up at 3:15 a.m. I have no clue who this woman is at all, but I still dream about her every now and then. Every single dream is in a different place, but she's just there, and this has been going on since I started working at my job. This happened 15 years ago. Most won't believe me, but for what it's worth, I promise everything I tell you is 100% true and how it happened to the best of my memory. However, names have been changed. I was about 18 and I was hanging out at my friend Joanne's house with some other school friends. I can't quite remember how we got into the subject, but towards the end of the evening, Joanne thought it would be fun to perform a seance. Joanne and her family were from Cape Town in South Africa and had a deep-rooted interest in the spiritual, or at least that's what Joanne made out to us. With the lights off and candles lit, we all sat at a round table with cards fanned out around the edge. Each card had a letter of the alphabet, arranged A to Z, and a shot glass placed in the middle. Joanne starts speaking out to the spirits in Afrikaans. I remember pulling a face and rolling my eyes. It was too dark for anyone to take offense. At the time, I was an insufferable, enlightened atheist teen dork. You know the type, cringy 4chan edgelord who thinks any form of spirituality or religion is beneath me and my superior intellect. I never wore a fedora, but I was damn close. However, what was about to happen made me question everything. It started mundane enough. A few questions were asked, and a shot glass we were resting our fingers on started to move to and fro, until eventually one of my friends asked the spirit if they were associated with anyone in the room. The shot glass moved directly towards me. Incredulous, I asked the spirit, "If you're associated with me, then what's my mother's maiden name?" My eyes fixated on the letters that spelled out her maiden name, Jones, but the glass started spelling out something different. First the glass went to T, then H, then O. I thought then it was BS, as it was completely wrong. Then I was struck by a horrific realization. When my mum was 6 months old, her biological father died of a heart attack, and a year after that, she took her stepfather's name. I completely forgot this in the moment, as I was expecting the glass to read out the maiden name she had for the majority of her life, but it was actually spelling out her original maiden name of Thompson. It was in fact so trivial that I barely remembered it myself. It was something never talked about, even within my family, as it happened so long ago. It would be hard to believe that any of my friends would know this esoteric piece of my family history that occurred 20 years before I was even born. But nonetheless, somehow it was being spelled out in front of my very eyes. Thompson. My school friends and I wouldn't talk about anything deeper than video games and boobs at that age, yet there's no way I ever mentioned this to any of them. It's not like my friends had a copy of my mother's birth certificate, and none of them had ever met anyone else in my family. There was literally no way anyone could have known this. Before I could contemplate this for too long, or ask another question to my ghostly associate, Joanne's mum came into the room and turns the lights on, and with a thick South African accent, shouts something like, "Bloody hell, Joanne, stop messing around with this silly crap," and put a definitive stop to the proceedings. Of course, at the time, I played it off as a prank, but the more I think of it, the more my mind wonders, did something actually paranormal happen that night? I know it's nothing dramatic or exciting. I didn't see an apparition or a cryptid, But this experience is actually true, and something to this day I can't explain. I'd love to hear your thoughts. After my university studies, I got a job as a research and teaching assistant while working on my PhD thesis. Working hours were pretty easy, and even when doing my own stuff, I rarely stayed later than about 10 p.m. About twice there were projects with my professor that had to be advanced or finished on a tight schedule, so I stayed late, like 2 or 3 a.m. Universities where I live are a lot like schools, as in the day it's crowded and loud and cheerful, but after hours it gets eerily quiet. Here people are not staying on campus, there isn't even something you'd call as such, so after lectures are done and the staff had left, it's basically empty. So there I was at 2 a.m. in a deserted building, and I swear there were noises like people walking up and down the corridors, voices, chatting, etc. It was pretty unlikely that people would be around at that time, but not impossible, and if so, had to be staff, because you couldn't get to that part of the building without proper clearance, so I shrugged it off. I had the lights on in my office, but apart from that, there was only that dim green security lighting. We had motion detectors for our full lighting, and I'm telling you, I'm a science person. I don't really believe in the supernatural, or if so, I don't think it's necessarily malevolent. But when I was sat there in my office and realized the motion-controlled lights were going on in the hallway, of course, ever getting closer to my office, exactly as if someone or something was moving closer and closer to me, I felt the chills and still feel them when thinking about that night. I never saw anything move past my office that night. It was just the lights going on in that fashion and the noises. Oh, and as an added bonus, before they installed the law school in those buildings, they were part of a hospital. So my point on things that exist beyond our perception is somewhat less pronounced since that night. I work at a plant or warehouse that makes paper products. When they built the facility, they built around a farmhouse that was built back in the 70s. The employees use this place for meetings and business parties. I got hired 3 years ago as security and worked mainly graveyard shifts, with only 2 guards here after morning shift, me and a supervisor. We have to patrol a facility at least once per shift. After a few months, I got comfortable and started doing patrols swiftly. This time around, I felt an eerie presence following me around the facility. I got to the farmhouse. My gut was telling me no, but the job required me due to having to press a button to show I'm doing patrol. I turn on all the lights like I usually do, check for locked doors and break-ins. I take a whiz, and while doing so, the whole power shuts off. The radio stops working. I call my supervisor to tell him the power is out. He checks on cameras and sees the house lit up because I usually turn on all the lights. I FaceTime him to show I'm in pure darkness, and he tells me to come back to the main guard shack. I check back and see the lights are all on, as if nothing ever happened. We were the only 2 people in the facility due to it being a holiday. A little backstory. I'm from Northern California, the Sacramento area. All my life I wanted to be a cop. After the army, I got hired as a sheriff's deputy in Sacramento in late 2011. I worked patrol and was on the CSI team as a collateral assignment, so I would work a normal 12-hour patrol shift, answering calls and doing standard cop stuff, and then go to the CSI calls for serious stuff. By early 2017, I was badly burned out and found a new purpose in life and quit. This story occurred in the end of 2016. I'm not religious at all, but I am spiritual. The house I grew up in as a kid was haunted by something serious, and I've experienced my fair share of serious paranormal events as a kid, but nothing since about the age of 15. I was 33 when this occurred. In late 2016, I was working day shift patrol in a smaller town in our county. I get sent to a Safeway grocery store to a report of domestic violence which was occurring inside the store. Being a deputy, I'm alone with no partner, but I have backup that's coming, but it's like 20 minutes away. It's reported that a younger Hispanic male is slapping around a younger Hispanic female. It's over now, and they are checking out and not fighting anymore. I show up and enter the store and immediately recognize these people. They are Norterno gang members. You see them now and again in the area, but it's semi-rural, and these people mostly lurk in Sacramento and don't really come to the area much. We were like 30 minutes away from Sacramento. I won't go into the whole thing, but I could just tell by how they were dressed and talking and appeared. The dude had some teardrop tattoo on his face and some crap tattoo on his neck. I knew what I was dealing with. They are compliant and say nothing happened and agree to come outside to talk. I pat them down, separate them, handcuff them, sit them down at a good distance apart from each other, and start interviewing one half of the party to figure out what occurred and if anyone needs to go to jail. They're both sitting on the curb out the front of the store with their legs kicked out, facing the parking lot. My back is to the parking lot and I'm facing the store. It's about 1 p.m. in the middle of a weekday in a strip mall. There are dozens of people shopping and going about their business. As I'm talking to one of them, getting their half of the story and taking notes, clear as day, I hear the most beautiful female voice I've ever heard in my life. It sounds smooth and almost like really a computer AI, like that customer phone support AI that you can't tell whether is human or not, but it's just a little too perfect to be human. The voice spoke inside my head. This was not my gut feeling, inner monologue, sixth sense, training, or whatever you want to call it. It was an outside voice that was not mine or from my thoughts, and it was beamed inside my head. All it said was, "Turn around." At the same time it took to say turn around, maybe a second, simultaneously I saw my entire life flash in front of my eyes, and then saw a Hispanic man in his 30s wearing blue jeans, Adidas shoes, and a red plaid long-sleeve lumberjack gang member shirt walk up behind me and shoot me in the back of the head in the parking lot. It's like a 33-year-long movie of my entire life just played out in half a second inside my head. So when a disembodied voice tells you to do something, you do it. So I turned around, and the exact person I saw in my vision of me dying, wearing the exact same clothes, with the exact same cars in the backdrop behind him as were in the vision, is walking up behind me. And this is about 15 feet from me. The exact person, like the guy from my vision, is now standing behind me. I confront him without pulling out my gun, and immediately can tell this dude is legit and is up to no good and is trying to purposefully sneak up behind me. I'm professional but firm, trying to address the situation and process what just occurred at the same time. I don't have time to deal with this guy and the other two detained persons. The short of it is the two detained people are his friends, and he wanted to come see what was happening as he was concerned for their well-being. Yeah, no. He gets told to basically screw off or he's going to go to jail, and he agrees that's a good idea, and he walks away back into the parking lot and disappears from view amongst the cars, like walks away easily 100 meters and appears to be gone. I go back to interviewing one half of this domestic, and about a minute later, the same thing occurs as the first time. Voice, vision, gang member, etc. Exact same thing. I turn around again and pull out my gun. I regret to this day not pointing it at him and proning him out on the ground. I would love to know if he actually had a gun, but I suspect he did based on how he was walking. He was holding up his pants at the belt buckle and moving behind me. I ask for my cover officer to expedite with lights and sirens. and the second this guy hears the sirens, he quickly walks into the store and disappears. Don't ask me why I didn't do what I knew was right, and as I was trained to do, i.e. point a gun at him and detain him. I just didn't. All I could think of is I just want this asshole away from my presence. I don't want to search him, get near him, talk to him, or deal with anything about him. All I want at this moment is for him to not exist and to be gone. He had a terrible energy to him, like an almost evil energy to him. I've only felt that type of energy coming from another person a few times in my life. People that have experienced this might know what I mean. That's it. Partner shows up, we deal with the couple. Male goes to jail for beating on his girl, and she goes about her business. I go to the store with my partner to look for the gun guy, and we never find him. He must have gone out the other entrance. I didn't mention it to anyone for years, and definitely not to any other cops, as they would have taken me off the streets. I can't prove it occurred, other than my word, one of the single craziest things that have ever happened to me. I've heard other weird stories as a cop from other cops, regarding hauntings and weird stuff, but this was the weirdest.